Previously, to that hypothetical 19th century person, I'd like to say, oh wait, I forgot that guy was hypothetical. So, I guess I now have to explain how the gas turbine revolutionized aviation. Well, let's start with a different invention that also revolutionized warfare. You know how a gun kicks back after firing? That's how a jet works. You shoot hot gas out of one end, and that generates the thrust in the opposite direction. Of course, strapping an old-timey cannon to the back of a plane and firing it will achieve, well, little. What we really need is continuous thrust. The easiest way to do that would be to replace the cannon with a tube that is open on both sides. We take fresh air from one end, spray some fuel on it, and shoot hot exhaust at the other end. And we have completed our first jet design, the ramjet. That took us no time. Nice. Now, a ramjet would be quite efficient at supersonic speeds. Very fast airflow means we can cram a lot of air into our engine and get a nice, clean burn. This is why ramjets have been used to power long-range missiles such as this thing and that thing and also these things. But there is a major problem here. The only way to draw fresh air into our ramjet is to keep moving forward. You know, like a shark. The efficiency of any ramjet standing still is precisely 0%. A ramjet-powered aircraft could never taxi to the runway, let alone take off. This is why ramjet-powered missiles have solid rocket boosters for the initial launch. The very few manned aircraft with ramjet engines either had some other type of engine for takeoff or were air-launched off of larger motherships. Okay, so what we really need is a way to cram fresh air into the engine without relying on forward speed. Well, we can install a compressor at the front end of the tube. This way we can draw air in continuously. But how do we power the compressor? One early answer was to just use the classic piston engine. This is called a motorjet. The Italians were the first to come up with this type of jet. Their N1 prototype flew as early as 1940. Later, the Soviets would try their hand at motorjet-powered aircraft due to, let's just say, unforeseen reasons. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you, Mikoyan's I-250 is one of my favorite aircraft. I just think it's neat, you know? At low speeds, you use the V12 engine, the same V12 engine from the Yak-3, to be exact, to turn a propeller. And at high speeds, you feather the prop and use the V12 to turn the compressor, feeding fresh air into the combustion chamber in the back. This is great because A, using prop power on takeoff makes for a shorter and easier takeoff run, and B, the jet can power the plane at speeds in which the prop becomes inefficient due to drag. By the way, this drag is why prop-driven fighters didn't have air brakes. If you wanted to slow down, you just pulled the throttle to idle, and the drag from the propeller would do the rest. And before you ask, no, this fucking thing was not a motorjet. It actually had two separate engines, a classic piston engine, the radial from the B-17 to be exact, at the front, and a turbojet, like the one from the P-59, if I'm not mistaken, at the back. Wait, so what's a turbojet? Well, you see, the motorjet offers best of both worlds to pilots. For the mechanic on the ground, it's the worst of both worlds. You have to do maintenance work on both the piston and the jet engine. But you see, maintenance is actually the least of your problems. A compressor will need anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 RPM to compress air. The best piston engines in the world, you know, the stuff you find in Formula 1 cars, will maybe do 19,000 RPM. So in a way, the piston engine is actually too slow to run a compressor. The Soviets were well aware of this problem, so they added a gearbox between the piston engine and the compressor in the I-250. Now, you might think that just running a gearbox will solve everything, but I mean, adding a gearbox in the middle of the airframe, well, that just adds weight and complexity to the system, doesn't it? You know what would be really convenient? Having a jet engine that's self-contained. What if we use the power from the jet engine to power the compressor? Then we wouldn't need the piston engine. But how can we do this? So, do you remember this thing? Okay, so this was powered by a steam turbine. It's quite simple. You boil water, the steam spins this thing, and that spins the ship's screw. I would like to thank Nathapon in the comment section for pointing this out. In a small ship like Turbinia, you can get away with driving the screw directly from the steam turbine. But in a larger ship, in something like a big battleship, it would be incredibly inefficient. Which is exactly why when they were building larger ships, they would put a gearbox between the steam turbine and the shaft that drives the screw. Of course, this gearbox has to take immense force. It has to endure immense RPM. So this is actually a very hard thing to engineer, but that's a story for another day. But just keep in mind the very high RPM generated by the steam turbine, and by any turbine really. It will come up later, I promise. Anyways, the turbine engine is much more efficient than a piston engine. You see, in a piston engine, you turn heat energy from the fuel into up and down movement of the pistons, and then you turn the up and down movement of the pistons into rotational movement. It's never straightforward. Every single piston engine has its own set of quirks. I would like to thank Sean in the comment section for pointing this out. Even before steam turbines, you had smaller vessels that could do over 20 knots. But you see, in a small torpedo boat that is powered by a steam piston engine, you would have immense vibration. So much so that these torpedo boats basically ended up destroying themselves. Thank you, Sean, for pointing this out. I mean, this is just one example of the quirkiness of piston-based engines. All piston engines are a bit quirky and a bit self-destructive. People have made YouTube careers out of explaining these quirks, basically. I'm not planning to do that, so let's move on. Okay, so a turbine turns heat energy directly into rotational movement. So we mount it in the hottest place possible, the rear end of the jet. Here it will be turned by the hot exhaust rather than superheated steam. Then we can run a shaft along the engine, not along the entire airframe, unlike the Mikoyan's i250, but rather just the engine, so that the turbine can send power to the compressor and our turbojet is ready. If you think this arrangement somewhat resembles the turbo in a car, you'd be correct. Early turbojets used centrifugal compressors, just like a car's turbo, as one car reviewer on YouTube once noted. The whole engine is just one big turbo. Now, centrifugal compressors were widely used in the early days because they were easier to engineer. But there are some problems with them. Firstly, the throttle control. It is very poor. It's well known that turbocharged cars have weird throttle responses. Now, imagine that there is no engine and you're trying to throttle the turbo. That's what the centrifugal turbojet is like. Another problem is size and scalability. The only way to make a more powerful centrifugal compressor is to increase the diameter. Okay, here's an example. This is a late model Spitfire. This is its canceled successor, the Spiteful. And now this is the Attacker, a jet fighter based off the Spiteful. It was powered by a centrifugal turbojet, rolls-royce mean to be specific. Notice how wide the fuselage is compared to its prop-driven predecessors. The first generation of jet fighters generally used centrifugal compressors, and that led to some notably thick designs, like this, and these. Of course, having a thick fuselage means more weight and more drag, which is terrible for high-speed flight. But wait, what's that? Look at that. Look at that nice narrow fuselage. How did they do that? Well, the Sabre used an axial compressor instead of a centrifugal one. This is a much different design, with back-to-back stages that compress the air more and more as it travels down the compressor. Such a compressor can be scaled up without making it wider and bulkier. The only real problem with early axial compressors was what they call surge. At low throttle, the compressed air might try to, escape out the way it came. This leads to engine failure. If it happens at high altitude, you can just restart the engine. But if it happens during landing approach, oh boy. Thankfully, there are solutions to this problem. You can, you can make the compressor blades variable pitch like a propeller. Or you can make an engine with multiple independent compressors and turbines. Both of these designs worked, and these axial turbojets went on to power the first supersonic jet fighters, like the Super Sabre and the Starfighter. The Starfighter's engine was later used in this fucking thing. I'll do a Phantom 2 video one day, I promise. But it's worth pointing out that Phantom 2 was the last major US fighter to be powered by turbojets. Its successors used something much more efficient. So here's the deal. A turbojet generates two kinds of movement. The movement of the air is obvious, but we must also remember the rotational movement of the turbo machinery inside the engine. A turbojet will do hundreds of revolutions per second. What if we turn some of this rotational movement into forward thrust? We can do this really easily if we add a huge fan to the turbojet's shaft. This is called a turbofan, and it's much more efficient than the turbojet, because we're moving a lot more air using roughly the same amount of fuel. Another great thing about turbofans is that you can optimize them by playing with the size of the fan. Modern subsonic airliners use a combination of a large fan and a small turbojet. We call this arrangement high bypass. Modern fighter jets, on the other hand, have low bypass turbofans optimized for both subsonic and supersonic speeds. As of the making of this video, the turbofan reigns supreme. As I mentioned, Phantom 2 was the last US fighter to use turbojets. Its immediate successors, the Tomcat and the Eagle, were powered by low bypass turbofans. There have even been turbofan-powered Phantoms. Royal Navy specifically ordered theirs to be powered by the rolls-royce Spey, which was a good call given that they were planning on putting their Phantoms on late Second World War era carriers. They needed all the engine thrust they could get. For comparison, the US Navy did use carriers of similar vintage in Vietnam, but they never really put their turbojet-powered Phantoms on those ships, Instead, they paired their old Essex-class ships with a much different beast, but that's a story for another day.